Hello, everybody. Welcome in live from New Orleans. This very special edition of DN90 presented by Dixie Vodka. Score a touchdown at your next tailgate with Dixie Vodka. Made in America, raised in the South. My name is Brandon Adams. Lucky enough to have Dog Nation's Mike Griffith with us here as well as we inch a little bit closer to the Sugar Bowl on Tuesday. And, Mike, one of the things that I find kind of fascinating here as we get towards the game, especially with the playoffs that took place last night, is there seems to be a little drama building here. You know, some Georgia players were upset last night on social media. There's a lot of talk about, obviously, transfers. Justin Fields, other players around the country. That starts to bubble up here. It certainly seems like, even though when Georgia and Texas play on Tuesday night, it won't be for the college football playoff, it will have the eyes of college football on what's going to go down inside the New Orleans Superdome.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Two of the best young coaches in the country look like they have promising futures. Great resources at Texas, great resources at Georgia. Only one up arrow can be pointing up after Tuesday night's game, BA, and I think that's what you're starting to feel from these players. Georgia has done a little bit of talking. They went out there and said, hey, we're one of the four best. Now that they've said it, they've got to back it up.
We'll have more on that coming up in a moment. Obviously, Dog Nation's Mike Griffith has had plenty of coverage, and Chip Towers as well at dognation.com over the course of the last few days. Let me start, though, with some of the news that's been out there over the last 24 hours. And obviously, one of the central figures in the game, at least in terms of media attention on Tuesday, is going to be Georgia's backup quarterback, Justin Fields, because there's certainly a strong indication this may be Fields' final game in a Georgia uniform. Well, there is a lot of talk coming from the school that Fields is presumed to at least be strongly considering transferring to, and that's Ohio State. Mike, let me give you a couple of things that his competitor, if he does indeed go to Columbus to play for Ohio State, Tate Martell, another former elite recruit at the quarterback position, some of the things that he said about Justin Fields just today. Of course, if you're watching here on this special presentation of DN90, we'll show some of this to you on the screen. But Tate Martell today, as his team is preparing for the Rose Bowl, was asked if he would consider transferring if Justin Fields came to Columbus. And Martell says, why would I leave for someone who hasn't put a single second into this program? I've put 2 years of literally working my, he says, ass off into something that I've been waiting for and dreamt about my whole life. To just run away from somebody who hasn't put a single second into winter workouts and doesn't know what the program is all about, there's not a chance. Tate Martell would then go on to say, I'm just going to tell you, if anyone comes in, it's going to take over a year to learn the offense to where you need to be to go on the field and perform at a high level. Just from that aspect, if someone thinks they're going to come in, walk in, and start, it's probably not going to happen. The offense that Coach Ryan Day has put in place, it's an NFL-type offense. It's difficult to learn. It takes a while for people to get that down. Those quotes coming from The Athletic a little earlier today. Really interesting here that for Justin Fields, who has been a part of a competitive situation with Jake Fromm, and presumably because of that, is now looking to transfer. Boy, one of those guys that he could be transferring there with at Ohio State is really drawing that line in the sand in terms of what that competition is going to be like. It sounds like Tate Martell, who's already been outspoken, at least presumably with some cryptic tweets about Fields not too long ago, it sounds like he's really drawing his line in the sand in terms of his desire to compete with Fields, and maybe he's even trying to scare Fields off that challenge.
Well, and I think he's right, though. I think it does take a year to learn the offense. I think Jake Fromm had the luxury of learning as he went and relying on two NFL starting running backs and a pretty good receiver with Wims and maybe one of the best offensive lines in the country. Whereas, Justin Fields, he'll go into this situation. Now, the learning curve will be a little shorter for him because he has put a year into a pro-style offense. He's learned a lot at Georgia. He's got to work with some great coaches and had some great competition with Jake. So he'll understand and know how to handle this competition if this is indeed where he goes. But the reality of the situation is it does take time to learn an offense, and I think that's what we saw with Justin Fields, BA, because we would see Justin in practice, and some of those live videos that I put up from here, you saw how big, how athletic, how well the ball comes off his hand, how accurate he is. But doing that with all the moving pieces and parts around you, getting the playoff on time, calling the protections, it's like learning to fly a jet. It takes time to learn where all the controls are at, and so that's all Martell is saying. Now, Martell hasn't done it in the games either, but he has been on campus. He will be further along, and the question is, will Justin's athleticism and abilities be good enough that Ohio State, or whomever he goes to beat out, is willing to simplify the offense and do less to have him out there where he can do more with his skills?
That's Mike Griffith. My name is Brandon Adams. You're watching a very special live edition of DN90 here from New Orleans as Georgia gets ready to take on Texas in the Sugar Bowl on Tuesday. We'll also hear from Georgia offensive coordinator coordinator Jim Chaney on the subject of Justin Fields coming up in a moment, but we can confirm, according to The Athletic and other sources from Pasadena today, that Justin Fields has indeed apparently been in contact with Ohio State because of something that Dwayne Haskins, the starting quarterback for the Buckeyes, says about the situation involving Justin Fields. He says it's a unique situation, sure. Justin's going through something right now, and he just wanted to ask me a couple of questions, a sentence that would seem to suggest that Fields has been in contact with Haskins, presumably about Ohio State. And he says, this is Haskins speaking. I answered it for him. That's it. I don't know what he's doing right now. He hit me up earlier, but he's waiting to see what I'm doing. I don't know what he's doing yet. So you can take that from Haskins, one of the finalists for the Heisman Trophy this year. He did field some questions from Justin Fields, presumably about the situation there at Ohio State. So for a lot of the conjecture that's been out there that Justin Fields would favor Ohio State over any other school that he could transfer to, those words from Dwayne Haskins would seem to at least give some voice to that, as quoted by The Athletic a little earlier today.
Yeah, ask me what I'm doing. What's the indication there? What does Justin want to know? And it's interesting. We're going to see more and more of this. And the reason why Georgia's getting this Georgia quarterback situation, when Alabama worked it all out, that went away quietly. The Clemson quarterback, Kelly Bryant, he left mid-season, and that kind of put the Georgia quarterback situation, Brandon, at the forefront of the country. And this is kind of the poster child situation for what you're going to see play out every year now. I said earlier with Chip Towers on a podcast, a video cast, that this year there's 2 guys in the portal. Next year there'll be at least 6. And you're going to see more and more of this. The Texas offensive coordinator, Beck, he was talking about the other day, this is going to proliferate. Every year there's going to be more and more players that put the feelers out and see if they're able to negotiate maybe a better deal. When I say a better deal, maybe a better playing situation, playing time. And it's going to be hard for coaches to keep that balance, because while you may be interested in players at other schools, you still got to show some loyalty to the players that you have on your roster. And I think Kirby Smart will benefit from this. I think this benefits Georgia. This benefits the better programs. The rich will get richer as a result of this process.
Georgia offensive coordinator Jim Chaney met with reporters earlier today from New Orleans. And as you might imagine, the subject of Justin Fields, among other things, does come up there in that discussion. Let's let you see a little bit of Chaney meeting with the media today. As we said, he was asked about what it was like having Justin Fields as a part of this program this year. Was it a challenge? Was it weird? How does this impact Georgia moving forward? And here is some of what Chaney had to say on that subject. Take a look.
Jim, I know we could go a while on Justin Fields and Jake Fromm this year, so I hate to ask a question to sum up everything from the last 4 or 5 months, but what was this like this season? What was the thought process on trying to get Justin into games and utilize his skill set, but when you had Jake Fromm and what he had accomplished last year and what he was doing this year?
Well, it's been tough. There's no question about that. But once again, if you separate the quarterback spot and look over there at the wide receiver spots and you say, hey, that kid standing by me on the sideline, but he has a unique skill set, let's try to utilize him. But if you look at the quarterbacks the same way, we kind of try to do that with Justin a little bit this year. So we don't want to leave our team in a disadvantage because of any particular position. So you try to do the best you can by utilizing the skill set of your existing players, and that's what we try to do. You look back on the season, I don't know. I'll reflect back on it when the season's all the way over. Right now, I think we did right, and we'll see how it plays out.
Over on the right in the front.
Hey, Jim. Chip Towers, Dog Nation, AJC. I was going to ask a similar question, but just more to the point, is Justin, for this game in particular, is he similarly employed in the game plan? Not to give anything away, but just anecdotally.
We haven't changed anything from what we've been doing throughout the season. I'll say that.
And is there any hesitancy, knowing that he could be gone, about what you put in front of that guy because he could be taking it with him?
No.
Over on the left-hand side in the center.
Hey, Jim. Mark Weiser, Athens Banner-Herald. We haven't had a chance to talk to you since August.
Hello, Mark.
Hey. I want to get your state of the union kind of the offense. It seems like you guys leaned more heavily on the passing game and were pretty much where you were last year in the running game. How do you guys think you did?
I feel good about it. I think that, as a coach nowadays, when you're clicking around that 40-point a game mark, you feel like you've done okay. You're scoring points. But when you sit in this chair, you're never happy. We're looking for that perfect game and perfection at all times. Are we content with what we got done? In some ball games, other games we didn't play particularly well. But I think we did throw the ball a little bit better than we have in the years past, and I do believe that'll continue to grow and continue to develop. And I've talked to you guys a lot about familiarity of offense, and now Jake just ran through his second year in the system, and that shows. That shows. You ask about Jeremiah, third year in the program. Those first 2 years, as we're playing with a bunch of young kids, except for the boys that took off for the draft. And I think I'm most proud of those kids that left for the draft and the quality individuals they are. The young kids stepped back up, and we were able to maintain and continue to achieve some points that we needed to win a few ball games.
So interesting stuff there from Georgia offense coordinator Jim Chaney. Mike Griffith here as a part of a very special edition of DN90 live from New Orleans. You were part of that press conference with Chaney today. What did you make of his remarks about Fields and his overall thoughts about how this season finishes up? Some pretty candid stuff from him about the LSU job, for instance, or I should say the LSU game earlier this year. What did you make of some of the stuff that Chaney had to say today?
I think Jim Chaney's a pretty direct, straightforward guy, and he's in line with Kirby. He's Kirby's guy. It's clear that him and Kirby are on the same page as far as how this quarterback situation was managed. I know Jim said he felt like they did it right, and I think what he means in terms of what Kirby had set forth to do, which was to keep the situation fluid, keep it open to competition, and do what was in the best interest of trying to help the team win. And ultimately, they tried to put Justin Fields in situations, Brandon, where his skills could take over and he could make plays. And, perhaps that fake punt isn't the best example, but certainly that was a situation with the season on the line where Justin Fields had the ball in his hands with a play that they'd practiced all year long. There was more than one option, and yet you didn't hear Georgia throw him under the bus for not making a play or checking out. It was just a situation where they wanted Justin to have an opportunity, and they believed in him to put him in that situation and take that gamble and bet on red number one, if you will. So I think that Jim is being honest and forthright when he says they did their best to do right, and I think they did do Justin Fields right. I think they gave him opportunities, and the missing part of this equation isn't that Justin wasn't good enough, it's that Jake was that good. Jake Fromm was the number 3 most efficient passer in the country and showed a lot of poise as a true freshman, and certainly this year as well. I don't think I would put the Alabama loss on him this year, or last year for that matter. If a safety rotates over, Georgia's probably got a national championship right now.
Certainly that's a thought that a lot of Georgia fans will have a hard time ever getting past. We got a lot to do here on this very special edition of DN90 tonight. Before we're done, I'll share some of my thoughts on the retirement of Mark Richt today. That announcement coming from the University of Miami, what he meant to Georgia for the 15 years he was UGA head coach. We'll do that before we're done. We'll also hear from Georgia assistant coach Dan Lanning about the role that he could play as Georgia looks for a defensive coordinator replacement for Mel Tucker. We'll do that. In just a couple of minutes, we're also going to get into what I thought was very interesting last night. Outspoken behavior on social media from a lot of Georgia players who clearly did not think that last night's college football semifinals represented the 4 best teams in America. A little bit of national media backlash to that. We'll tell you the latest on that coming up in a moment. But, Mike, while we have you here, would you mind if we take a few comments from the comment section? A lot of Georgia fans want to sound off. Let's go to the YouTube comment section here first. Patrick Nicholson says Jake Fromm is the man. And, Mike, that's one of the things I am looking forward to seeing, as Patrick mentions there on YouTube, what Fromm does do on Tuesday as a follow-up to what he did in the SEC championship game, where I thought he probably played his best series of football against maybe the best defense he's ever seen. I am really eager to see how he follows that up against Texas. Big stage, a lot of extra eyeballs probably paying attention to him because of the primetime spot there on January 1st, New Year's night. I am looking forward to seeing what Jake Fromm has planned as an encore.
Well, he's been very focused here. He was the first player off the airplane, and one of the things that he said at that press conference last Thursday, hard to believe it's already Sunday, was maybe show that we were one of the 4 best teams. So that whole mantra of Georgia wanting to prove they belonged in, it really kind of started with Jake, and he's a real inspiration and leader within that locker room, and this is going to be an opportunity for Jake to be even more assertive now, presuming Justin leaves and Dwan Mathis we know is coming in to learn from Jake Fromm, having talked to his father about that. This is going to give Jake an opportunity to step forward as even more of a leader, I believe.
I think you're right about that. Don't forget about Stetson Bennett there in the midst of all that as well. A couple Facebook comments about what happened last night. You saw Shabazz Ali says those late games last night were boring. I think a lot of folks agree with Shabazz on that. John Kaki also says that Georgia and Alabama are on equal footing. No one else is, period. And I have to admit, Mike, and you know that I'm a Georgia fan. I got the red shirt on right now. what John says there about Georgia and Alabama being on equal footing, I have to admit, when you've watched some of that narrative that has emerged over the last 24 hours, I don't think Georgia has gotten credit for being capable of doing something that Oklahoma last night proved incapable of, which is truly taking Alabama down to the wire. For the most part, the points that Oklahoma scores last night in the Orange Bowl are done so in kind of a garbage time fashion. I'm not saying a close loss to Alabama is in and of itself a playoff resume, but pretty clearly Alabama has been tested by Georgia more over the last 2 seasons than it has by anybody else.
Yeah, Georgia's outplayed Alabama for the better part of the last 2 years. They've either led or been tied 281 out of 290 plays and 119 out of 120 minutes. They were either tied or led, and give Alabama a lot of credit for pulling it out. It's not about Georgia being chokers. It's about Alabama stepping up and winning football games. And these are games that could go either way. I mean, Alabama's been pretty fortunate, whether you want to look at some of the calls or non-calls or fumbles into the end zone that bounce back into a guy's hands or over the middle. We could go on and on about the crazy breaks that Alabama seems to have gotten when it appeared to me that Georgia was the better football team in the last 2 meetings. Now, overall, I think Alabama had a better season. This particular season, Alabama had historical success. It was the most dominant SEC regular season in history by any football team, with an average victory margin of 35.2. And yet, and still, Brandon, as I sat next to you in the press box, you know that I, more than anyone, thought that game was over with, to the point where you told me, just stop, I don't want to hear it anymore. And I kept saying, they're going to win, Brandon. There's no way, because I really thought it was over.
I'm probably not the first person to say to Mike Griffith, just stop, I don't want to hear it.
Probably not. But that particular night, I absolutely knew there was no way Alabama was. And I don't think they would have if DeAndre Walker wouldn't have gone out with an injury. I thought that was huge and very overlooked by people.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. This is a special edition of DN90 presented by Dixie Vodka. That's Mike Griffith. My name is Brandon Adams. We'll have a live video coverage for you all throughout the next few days as we head towards New Year's night. Georgia versus Texas in the Sugar Bowl. But last night, with Notre Dame getting blown out by Clemson, with Oklahoma for the most part getting blown out by Alabama, although the Sooners do eventually cover the Vegas point spread, you saw a lot of Georgia players basically with like laughing emojis and a lot of outspoken stuff about these are supposed to be the 4 best teams. And Mike, you talk to Georgia players virtually every single day, and you know how trained they are, for the most part, to sidestep controversy, really taking great pains to do that. How surprised by what you saw on Twitter last night, and just your overall thoughts about a pretty collective message from Georgia that they're pretty upset about being left out of the playoff? What was your reaction to what you saw last night?
Well, it showed just how much these guys were hurt. It showed just how much it bothered them. And it also showed me that Kirby Smart let it happen. Kirby wasn't shutting them down. I mean, all it would have taken is one text from the coach to say, no more guys. But Kirby is pretty upset too. If you remember, Kirby Smart was the one that said it all boils down to if you want the 4 best teams. And I think Kirby, and to his credit, probably recognized that these guys needed to vent, and they deserve an opportunity to vent. They didn't, as DeAndre Swift said, nobody was disrespectful to anyone. It wasn't like they were saying these, teams, you're horrible. It was just made very clear that the Georgia players were upset. And to their point, they were making the point that, hey, we were one of the 4 best teams. We would have given y'all a better game than this. And I think everybody out there watching agreed, whether they don't like Georgia or they want to come up with some reason why they want to pretend Georgia isn't one of the 4 best. Everybody watching those games sat back and said, you know what? Georgia darn near beat Alabama. Georgia was one of the 4 best teams. Now, whether they deserved being or not, that's a whole different discussion. But the last time I checked, they say it's the 4 best teams. I got a direct quote up there from Rob Mullins, who said it wasn't about 2 losses. So make what you will of it. As I said, I'm sure that the Florida athletic director and the Georgia Tech athletic director, who are 2 of the 13 members, I'm sure they lost all sorts of sleep that Georgia wasn't in the playoff. And that's part of the problem, quite frankly, Brandon. I don't know how you can have athletic directors from some schools and not others and not expect there to be the potential for some agenda.
Well, be that as it may, what you do see bubbling up on the heels of Georgia's players saying what they said on social media is now some national media backlash that I think in a roundabout way actually makes what's going to happen against Texas all the more interesting on Tuesday night. Right. Let me give you a few examples here in this special edition of DN90 live from New Orleans. Let me start with Dennis Dye from CBS Sports, who tweets this out. Georgia wouldn't have beaten Clemson. But that's not the point. UGA lost to LSU by 20. It was bordering on non-competitive. Also blew a 2-touchdown lead to Alabama. That's not a positive. That's really bad. Committee got the right 4. What Dodd seems to be saying there is almost a direct repudiation of some of the outcry from Georgia fans and Georgia players. Alex Kirshner from SB Nation says UGA gets to destroy Texas and spend the whole offseason pretending Clemson wouldn't have beaten them by 21 points. They're the biggest winners of the bowl season. Let me stop right there before we hear from some more. We're going to hear from Joel Klatt on Fox Sports in a moment. I love Alex Kirshner from SB Nation and Dennis Dye from CBS Sports, saying it's basically a given, a foregone conclusion that Clemson would have beaten Georgia, or to quote Alex Kirshner here, all of a sudden it's some sort of prognosticator that Clemson would have beaten Georgia last night by 21 points. Now, I don't know how much time Alex Kirshner spent perusing like the advanced metrics, the analytics, things like that. Dennis Dot either. But you'd be hard-pressed to find any analytics measurement where Clemson ranks ahead of Georgia, even though they rank ahead of Georgia in the human polls and rank ahead of Georgia in the college football playoff rankings. You look at Football Outsiders, you look at Football Study Hall, things like that. Georgia does just fine against Clemson and a lot of those kinds of metrics there. So this notion that Clemson would have beaten Georgia last night by 21 points, that seems like an awful lot of recency bias from national writers who ought to know better.
Yeah, and a lot of naivety as well. Clemson was fortunate to win at Texas A&M 28-26, and A&M had about 25 first downs, and Clemson had 16. And I think the last time I checked, didn't South Carolina score 4 or 5 touchdowns on Clemson and when they met this year? So,
well, of course, South Carolina also got shut out by Virginia, so maybe using South Carolina as your argument may not be the best right now.
Well, no, that's my point. If South Carolina was able to score that much on the Clemson defense, I imagine what the Georgia offense would have
Fair
done.
enough.
So, and furthermore, if Clemson was in the SEC, they wouldn't have put together an 11-1 regular season. They would have lost 2 or 3 football games. But when you play in the ACC, you don't have the depth of competition. You don't play Kentucky, Florida, and Auburn in successive weeks, as Georgia did, and dominate all 3 of those opponents. And yeah, LSU was a tough loss, but let's give LSU some credit. They converted 4 fourth downs, and Georgia was uncharacteristically ineffective early in that game, and there was over 100,000 people there, and LSU had some momentum. Also a pretty tough place to play. I don't know the last time Clemson played there, but a little bit tougher than probably playing at Wake Forest.
The most aggressive tweet of all, at least in terms of the national media guys that I saw, came from Joel Klatt from Fox Sports. Let me read to you what Klatt puts out on Twitter, and this is after he had tweeted to Elijah Holyfield for Holyfield had tweeted kind of a string of laughing emojis. Klatt tweeted directly to him and then tweets this. This is Joel Klatt from Fox Sports saying, I'm seeing a few of the Georgia players with strong feelings towards tonight's game. He's actually referencing the Clemson-Notre Dame game at this time. Maybe if they would have been as intense against LSU, they would be in the game. He uses a question mark, although that's inappropriate, based on that sentence structure. But nonetheless, you had your chance, boys. # false hustle. Boy, I got to tell you, for a lot of people, this noted SEC hater like Joel Klatt tweeting that's really going to fall flat with a lot of people there, what Klatt has to say, Mike. And I'm imagining, based on the look in your face, you probably agree.
I think Kirby Smart probably loved it and said, somebody get that up on the wall. Make sure that's the first thing they see when they go in the locker room, because Georgia absolutely feasts on this. Every time somebody has talked garbage about Georgia. Remember the South Carolina game? Seems like a long time ago. All the talk from all the national analysts, this was the big upset special. It was going to be South Carolina's time. They were going to beat Georgia and Columbia, and Georgia went in there and absolutely clobbered them. And then, but now it's Missouri. Danny Sheridan, the USA Today analyst, this is really Missouri's time. And Georgia went in there, and a good Missouri team, and Georgia handled them by 2 touchdowns. It's been one doubter after another. Quite frankly, I've said this before in the program, Brandon, the country and college football in general is not ready for Georgia to become a dynasty. They're rooting against that. They've had enough of the SEC, and everybody wants to pretend that the 2 best teams are playing. That's the clean narrative. That's the healthy narrative. Everybody wants to put Georgia in the rearview mirror. It's going to be up to Georgia to change that narrative on Tuesday night against Texas.
Well, let me play devil's advocate just for a moment, because you cited some examples where Georgia kind of fought back against trash talk that was started by somebody else. What Debo Samuel says about DeAndre Baker, for instance. The same thing with, say, Jonathan Abram a year ago with Mississippi State or some things like that. That's an example of Georgia pushing back against someone else's bulletin board material. In this case, though, Georgia would seem to, the tweet from McCole Hardman, the tweet from Cade Mays, the tweet from Elijah Holyfield, would seem to almost be generating its own bulletin board material. Is it a mistake? I think it's a fair question to ask, even if Georgia fans were to say no. Is it a mistake for Georgia to put extra pressure on itself against Texas by being as outspoken as it was on Saturday night?
No, because the head coach has already set the example. If Kirby would have came in there after the SEC championship game and said, well, we had our chance, we're ready to take our medicine, we'll be back next year, that would have been one thing. But Kirby was very vocal that this was one of the 4 best teams in the country. He was very vocal that this is a system that changes from year to year and that the 4 best teams were not in. And the players take on the personality of the coach. Kirby Smart felt like his program was insulted and not given enough credit. And certainly these guys can look at the All-SEC team picked by, I don't know who was on this AP panel, certainly not myself or Chip Towers. I don't know who the Georgia representative was, but there was one guy who made first-team All-SEC. Now, you're telling me that Kentucky has 3 first-team guys and Georgia has 1. So I think that collectively Georgia recognizes that they have not been given credit. And I feel bad about that because I watched this team grow. Listen, at the start of the year, this front 7 was not championship caliber. At the start of the year, the first 5 SEC games, these running backs didn't break a run longer than 30 yards against SEC competition. And before the bye week, Jake Fromm was 3 of 20 converting on 3rd and 9 or longer. But since that bye week, this team has put it together. They worked hard, they got focused, and they took care of business, and they were unquestionably not just one of the 4 best teams in the country, but one of the top 2.
James Crump on the Facebook comment section says, stop calling the playoffs the 4 best. It's the 4 most deserving.
Well, the thing is it's by the letter of the law. It's the playoff committee that says the 4 best. It's not us saying that. And to James's point, they need to stop picking it like it's the 4 most deserving. If they want to pick the 4 best, then they need to have the backbone to be willing to put 2 SEC teams in and leave 3 Power 5 conferences out. But as Kirk Herbstreit said, Brandon, they took the political route and tried to make these conference commissioners happy. And sure enough, the Big 12 commissioner came out and said the system works fine. I doubt he'd have said that if Oklahoma didn't get in.
Justin Dinkins has an interesting comment on the YouTube comment section. He says, where are all the Georgia fans that said Notre Dame compete against Clemson? I'll be the first to tell you, Justin, on Dog Nation Daily, that's exactly what I said. I expected a closer game from Notre Dame. I'm telling you right now, I'm done with these Midwest teams against the Deep South teams. Unless there's a overwhelmingly compelling reason to take a team from outside the South against a team like Clemson, which plays very much an SEC brand of football, I'm just not doing it anymore. I've got a lot of crow to eat for even thinking that Clemson could be kept close by Notre Dame because, in retrospect, those 2 teams could play 10 times. I don't think it's ever going to be close.
Well, you got to give Notre Dame credit. They did beat Vanderbilt by 6 points earlier this year. I think Ohio State is probably the team from the Midwest that you have to look at because they recruit nationally, and they did have Urban Meyer, and I'll be curious to see what this new coach does. But Urban Meyer certainly understood what it took to compete against SEC competition.
All right, coming up in just a moment, we're going to hear from Georgia assistant coach Dan Lanning on how he could fit into the new conversation for defensive coordinator at UGA. This is from earlier in the week. This is really interesting stuff. We'll do that in a moment. Let me show you one more tweet before we get there, though. And not every national writer's criticism last night of Georgia. There were at least a couple of guys who also had some complimentary things to say about how Georgia might feel being left out of the discussion. Here's from Bruce Feldman, also from The Athletic, tweeting this last night that he had gotten a text from an FBS head coach who says this. This is a very interesting quote from Bruce Feldman. We'll show you this on the screen. When will the College Football Playoff Committee actually watch personnel? He means players. Notre Dame doesn't have players anywhere close to the 3 other teams or Georgia, this coach tells Bruce Feldman. It's like watching an NFL team play a college team. That's a very interesting text from a coach to Bruce Feldman, a plugged-in national writer. And if you're a Georgia fan, I don't know how that's supposed to necessarily make you feel, but I guess it's at least some consolation knowing that someone, a credentialed someone, a head coach in this case, apparently noticed what a lot of Georgia fans notice, which is that Notre Dame just does not have a lot of players that could start for Georgia. And I think we'll see that proven out when those 2 teams play next September in Sanford Stadium. If you're a Georgia fan, you're upset about the way this unfolded last night, I think you've got a right to be.
Yeah, and I think I'd want to go to the Notre Dame game if I was a Georgia fan as well, because you better believe that Georgia's going to understand what's at stake, and this particular year's playoff will be brought up to them. There's a lot of motivation for Georgia in the Sugar Bowl. I know that Texas fans are going to outnumber them 2-1. I understand that. This is a really big deal for Texas, Brandon. Hard to believe Texas has not played in a bowl game outside of the state of Texas since 2011. Texas has not played in a New Year's game since 2009. So here's an opportunity for Texas, as you said, to take a giant step forward, to put a big head on the wall, the Hunter's plaque, and say, look, we got us a Georgia Bulldog. We got a team that was supposedly as good as Alabama, that was competing for national championships, and we're Texas, and we took them down. So they're playing for a lot, too. And meanwhile, Georgia is playing for pride. I think the talk, if you want to call it that, the social media reaction, I think this puts Georgia in a situation where they now have to represent and back up their words. I think Kirby Smart knows how to motivate his team. I think he stuck up for his team. He fought for his team, and he allowed those kids to represent themselves last night. Nobody went over the line. Sorry that some people got their feelings hurt, that Georgia feels they're one of the 4 best teams, but they're human beings. They've worked very hard, and they were very hurt that they were left out.
By the way, Curtis Cruz giving us the horns down in the Facebook comment section. Be interesting to see if that gets flagged for a penalty if a Georgia player does that on Tuesday night. It's a live edition here of DN90 from New Orleans. That's Mike Griffith. My name's Brandon Adams. Thanks so much for being in. If you haven't tried Dixie Vodka yet, the South's best tasting vodka, it'll certainly juice up your tailgate. You'll be really glad to have that. So check out Dixie Vodka online at dixievodka.com. You can find recipes there. Or you can just go to your favorite liquor store and say, hey, show me where the Dixie Vodka is, and they'll take good care of you there in that regard. Let me change the subject here just for a moment, because we heard a little earlier from Georgia offensive coordinator Jim Chaney, but when the Georgia defensive coordinator was supposed to speak this week, obviously the problem there is that there is no Georgia defensive coordinator in play. So being tasked with the pinch hit duties was Georgia outside linebackers coach Dan Lanning. I think for the most part, I think Lanning passed with flying colors. I think a lot of the media members were impressed with what Lanning had to say. He did talk about his potential chance of being the Georgia defensive coordinator and how close he almost became to being Colorado's defensive coordinator. In fact, let's hear him being asked about that right now as he addresses the rest of the issues there in terms of how he could potentially fit into maybe getting an interview. Maybe he's already been interviewed. He dodges that a little bit, but he does talk a bit about the Georgia defense. Here is Georgia assistant Dan Lanning on this very special live edition of DN90.
A couple direct questions. Did you have a chance to follow Mel to Colorado as defensive coordinator, and also what are the chances that you might be Mel's replacement at Georgia?
I don't really want to speak to that. Right now, our focus is on this game. I have all the respect in the world for Mel Tucker. I love Mel Tucker. He's been a great mentor and friend in this business. But moving forward right now, our focus is on this game, the first.
Chip Towers, Atlanta Journal-Constitution's Dog Nation. Kind of the same question. I've just wondered, have you interviewed for the Georgia's defensive coordinator job, or would that even be necessary?
Our complete focus has been this game, and then, leading up to this game, we had our signing day, so, I think opportunities and decisions will be made. There's probably a ton of, and there is a ton of interest. This is the Georgia defensive coordinator job. There's a ton of interest in that job. We're going to be able to attract a lot of great candidates for that position. We have a lot of great people on staff and in-house. Like I said, I think everybody's kind of taking a piece of the pie, stepping forward, moving into this game, and what it'll look like from a play caller, signal caller standpoint into this game. And then after the game, I think there'll be some decisions made as what that looks like moving forward.
One of the guys that stepped up in the middle has been Tate Crowder, who is he changed position from running back.
That's
Can you
right.
talk about his development?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. You talked about a guy named Roquan earlier. Roquan played running back in high school as well. Tate Crowder played running back. That always seems to be a really smooth transition for players that have good vision. They can play the running back position and then turn. And then when we look for linebackers in our league, and certainly like the Big 12, you're looking for guys that can run. And Tay's one of those guys that can run. And you don't create some of those same matchup issues that can happen on a back end, the backfield, or a wideout that he might have to match up with, or a tight end that he might have to match up with. So that's something Tay's done a really good job of this year.
How have you seen Monty Rice develop, not just as a player, but as a leader of that group?
Yeah, Monty's got a great personality, and I don't know if everybody knows that hasn't been around our program. He's a guy that's a lot of fun to be around, has a smile on his face, and works extremely hard at his craft. He's a smart guy, really intelligent, and he's a heavy hitter. When he puts his pads on you, I think guys feel it. So it's exciting to see some of the things that Monty's been able to do this year, and looking forward to the things he's going to do for this program for a long time to come.
As far as your own particular position group, I know DeAndre Walker obviously provided a ton of leadership from that standpoint, but that was also a very young position. guys like DeAndre Walker, Adam Anderson, what were some of the challenges they faced this year, and how they ultimately progressed to your satisfaction?
Yeah, DeAndre's role, obviously shifted from last year to this year, and he's done a phenomenal job for us. I think we're really excited about the things DeAndre's done this year, and how he's kind of a dynamic player from a standpoint of he's a guy that can set the edge and have heavy hands and play the run, but also has the ability to rush the passer. Has done a really good job with that. And Adam's a guy that you mentioned that's just continued to come along, throughout the season, get a better concept of what we do defensively, and his athleticism really speaks for itself. He could run for days, and it's always good when you have guys that can run on the field. But you got some other guys like Brenton Cox, Aziz Ojolari, Walter Grant that have all done a really good job this season, helping us in a number of ways.
You talked earlier about the Texas quarterback and his ability to run. When you think back to your team's game against LSU, Joe Burrow ran 13 times, 60-some yards. Do you see any similarities or comparison to what they do with their quarterback and LSU and Joe Burrow in that game?
Offensively, they're a lot different team than LSU. But yeah, there's definitely some similarities between the two quarterbacks. They're both really good players, and both can hurt you with their feet if you don't do a good job being accountable for the quarterback. So, I think that's something that we're prepared for. But as far as the offenses go, they're two completely different offenses.
All right, really good stuff there from Georgia assistant coach Dan Lanning. Mike, I know you had a chance to ask some questions of Lanning, and it's a rarity to get a chance to speak to one of the Georgia assistant coaches. What did you think of what Lanning had to say? And as a guy that's covered college football for a long time, would you mind also giving us a couple thoughts on how you think the Georgia defensive coordinator search is going at the moment? There's obviously not a huge reason for Georgia to have a defensive coordinator. It seems like its recruiting efforts are pretty well taken care of, although admittedly four-star defensive back Khair Elam had a close relationship with Mel Tucker. I'm sure he's looking to see how Georgia replaces its DC. But for the most part, the recruiting efforts seem to be well taken care of. The game plan for Texas seems to be pretty well fashioned as well. So there's no need to rush this hire. But what do you make of the process and the way this is playing out right now?
Well, Kirby's going to be thorough with this. This opening kind of bumped up against the early signing period, so Georgia hadn't put a whole lot of time or effort into it. They had to secure that fantastic early signing class, and then it was right on to bowl prep in a game that I think Kirby realizes it will be very big in the world of perception and thus have a direct effect on recruiting. I mean, as I said at the start of the podcast tonight, only one person's arrow can be pointing up after this game, and Georgia has been a program that's ascending, and while it may be viewed by some as a program that took a step back this year by missing the playoff, the reality of it is if Notre Dame doesn't go undefeated, Georgia's probably in the playoff. That was the wild card that forced the committee's hand to make that political move and lead the Bulldogs out. So to your point, back to the coordinator situation, the AFC Coaches Convention is January 6th through the 9th. I believe Kirby will be very thorough. I'm sure he wants to see who comes out of the woodwork, who will be interested in working with him at Georgia. Kirby's a guy that likes to learn a lot from other coaches. He's been very complimentary of the Texas defensive coordinator this week. In fact, there's a lot of speculation, a lot of names out there. If it is internal, certainly he'll look at the guys from within his staff. That's the model at Alabama, right? People learn the system and move up. And I would say that Glenn Schumann and Lanning would be good co-defensive coordinators if he were to go that route. A couple young guys, 32 and 28. And then there's Derek Ansley out there. He's 37 years old, currently the secondary coach of the Oakland Raiders, his first year out there in the NFL, but prior to that was Nick Saban's secondary coach and spent some time with Coach Smart when Kirby was at Alabama with Nick Saban. So someone who's familiar with how Georgia does things, who's very impressive, a guy I spoke with last year, and it's just a matter, would Derek Ansley be interested in that? Would Kirby be interested in him? So those are the names to me at the front of the list. I heard someone throw Kevin Shear's name out there, and obviously he was at Georgia before. Not really sure how likely that would be. He did leave Georgia and has a good situation with Jeremy Pruitt at Tennessee, and I'm not sure how that would reflect on the staff that stayed here with Kirby and didn't leave. So, but there's a lot of stuff bouncing around out there. But I would say probably the co-defensive coordinators or the Derek Ansley route would still be my leading contenders. But you just never know who's going to emerge after this bowl game.
Yeah, I can say, and I think I speak for a lot of Georgia fans when I say this, that there are only a couple of outside names that would get me excited because I think the Georgia defensive game plan is good enough, both recruiting and on field, that it can, kind of promote from within. You mentioned that. if Georgia had a chance to hire Derek Ansley, that's a move I think you got to make. The other name I'd kind of add to that in terms of if you can do it, you have to. That's a guy like, say, Corey Raymond, who's over at LSU, a defensive backs coach. And, I wouldn't pretend to know if Raymond's indeed interested in making that move over. But it's one of those guys, much like Ansley, that would fill in that void as a defensive backs coach, but also bring that black belt level recruiting. That's one of the things that would get me excited, both, an Ansley or a Raymond. Beyond that, I'm fine with promoting Dan Lanning. I'm fine with promoting Glenn Schumann. I think they'd both be pretty good at the job, but you're going to have to go out and find another recruiter at some point. A guy like Bakari Rambo stepping up into that role also seems to make some sense as well.
Absolutely. I could see Bakari as a secondary coach if they promoted within. The bottom line is this, and I was talking with BJ earlier, one of our bosses. If this was the offensive coordinator, I think we'd all be flipping out a little bit because, wholesale changes. Jim Chaney is essentially, I know he works within Kirby's framework, but Jim has a lot of latitude, and a lot of that offense is his identity. This defensive identity is Kirby Smart, and it's not going to change that much regardless of who he hires. So as important as it is to get a good mind and a good recruiter, it's important to get somebody who knows they're going to be working with a very high energy level coach who's very involved. That's the way Kirby is, even more involved on the field, many say, than Nick Saban. So that's a big part of the equation is they got to know what they're getting into because Kirby is a very energetic, involved, and demanding coach. He raises the bar on everyone nonstop. So I think that's a big part of the equation, and certainly I think that kind of maybe narrows the pool down a little bit. That's why you don't hear these big names. You don't need somebody else's defense coming in here. Kirby Smart is the defensive guru.
In our YouTube comment section, Chevron Hannah is predicting a blowout win for Georgia against Texas. I want to get a final thought from you on the Sugar Bowl here in a moment, Mike, while we have you here. Let me take a second, though, to address the Mark Richt news of today. And I know some people in our comment section earlier mentioned that they were just now hearing about this, the retirement of Richt from Miami. We'll talk about this here as a part of a very special live DN90 from New Orleans as we're getting ready for the Sugar Bowl next week. Or not next week, it's Tuesday. I'm sure it probably seems like next week for you. You've been here such a long time. It's Tuesday. Of course, it's all presented by Dixie Vodka here tonight. I think, Mike, sometimes it can be a challenging situation for fans to know how to process a guy like Richt who comes just close to winning the ultimate prize, the national championship, but doesn't quite get there. Had Richt won a national championship, you may name the field after him. It may be Sanford Stadium at Mark Richt Field, or he may get a statue out in front of the stadium. When you only win 2 SEC championships, and I say only in the context and comparison of what could have been done with a national championship, and Richt was close to that a couple of times. When it's less than a national championship, sometimes it can be a little confusing to say, what is his place in Georgia history? Well, I'm a guy that I feel like has studied the history of the Georgia program about as well as probably anyone could. And I am a firm believer that Mark Richt does truly have a special place in Georgia's football history. It's probably less than the legendary coach Vince Dooley. It may end up being less than what Kirby Smart puts together at Georgia because it certainly seems like his career has gotten off to a great start. But just because it's less than those two names doesn't mean it's a less than career. It's an amazing thing to go back and think, Mike, back in 2002 when Georgia went to the SEC championship and won that game against Arkansas. The first time Georgia had been to that stadium to play in that game, how big of a deal it was. Mark Richt brought that to Georgia, and that was a huge thing. And I, for one, have incredibly fond memories of the 15 years that he was Georgia's coach. And I think in addition to the fact that he clearly, by almost anyone's estimation, did things the right way, he also won a heck of a lot of football games. And I, for one, look forward to celebrating Richt's career a lot in the years to come.
Yeah, I think he's a Hall of Famer. I do. I think Mark Richt's a college football Hall of Famer. Not sure about first ballot, but close. And just as an analogy, I know you said if he'd won a national title, that would have changed things. But, Philip Fulmer won 2 SEC titles and 1 national title in 15 years, and that didn't help him on the back end of his career with Tennessee. And I dare say, Philip Fulmer's probably their number 2 legend, as Mark Richt is. I mean, obviously, General Nealon is the man that's celebrated at Tennessee, as Vince Dooley is rightfully celebrated at Georgia. But I think Mark Richt is the modern era legend, and I do think he left the program in good shape. And to be fair, Kirby Smart hasn't really done more than Richt in the sense of, had this still been a BCS with 2 teams, Georgia doesn't doesn't even make the playoff last year. They were the number 3 seed. So think how much Mark Richt would have benefited from a 4-team playoff. Could that team that won the Sugar Bowl here against Hawaii been a college football playoff team and won the national championship? I would suggest that they could have. Times change now, and now this playoff opens up some new opportunities, and Kirby Smart has been able to advance the ball. He's taken what was a very sound program, a very sound, stable program that had stayed away from NCAA issues, which is a very big component with programs. We've seen, speaking of Tennessee, we've seen how those type of things with Lane Kiffin can derail a program for years. Georgia stayed away from that. Mark Richt developed more, had more players drafted in the NFL than even Nick Saban since 2002. And, you look at what Mark did, and he won and brought a lot of class that Kirby has maintained. I mean, if there's one thing about Georgia football, and I say this as someone who's covered Georgia as an outsider, as an Auburn beat writer, as an Alabama beat writer, as a Tennessee beat writer, and even working in the Big Ten for 4 years, you look at Georgia and you think about class. You think about a successful, proud program that recruits in state and does it first class. Now, part of that has to do with the best public relations staff in America with Claude Felton, but part of it is Mark Richt. And one short anecdote, in 2007, I was the football writers president of America. I got one letter from a head football coach in the mail congratulating me. It was Mark Richt. I'd only met Mark Richt one time, but apparently every year he sends that letter out to recognize and congratulate the writer. So he's a first-class individual who's done incredible things to represent the program, and again, leave it on good footing. I mean, it was Mark Richt that left Roquan Smith here, and Sony Michel, and Nick Chubb, and now it's Kirby Smart who's advancing the ball with these great recruiting classes and appears to be on the cusp of doing even more. And it was Kirby Smart also today, Brandon, one of the very first people to reach out to Mark Richt on social media and thank him and wish him well in his future.
There's a lot on Mark Richt right now, DogNation.com. We'll have more in the days ahead. But, Mike, in the couple seconds we have before we go off the air here in this very special edition of DN90 presented by Dixie Vodka, we're 2 days away from the Sugar Bowl on Tuesday. A quick final thought from you about where your thought process is going to be in the final 48 hours before this game kicks off against the Longhorns.
Yeah, looking forward to it for the Georgia players. You can't help but want to see these guys do well. They've been so focused, and all season long they've worked so hard. They improved so much in areas that I didn't even know they could improve in. The way they controlled Alabama just was just a tribute to them, the way that front seven played and the way Jake and his receivers were in sync. They've come so far. They stayed out of trouble off the field. There weren't any distractions. That's a credit to the discipline and the leadership within the team. It's a credit to the seniors. It's a credit to the coaching staff. So, you want to see Georgia finish strong. You feel like they deserve it. But I'll tell you this, watching Texas practice, they passed the eyeball test. And another factor to consider, Texas has 13 seniors. And there's a lot of guys that are going to be trying to make a memory against Georgia. So this isn't going to be a pushover. Texas is more physical than the typical Big 12 team. When they play well, they play really well. They beat Oklahoma earlier this year. And they do have some players that are of good size. It's not like Georgia's going to go out there and play a smallish Big 12 team that they can simply overpower. I think Georgia's going to have to execute and be dialed in. I expect a really good football game that goes 4 quarters.
Well said from Mike Griffith. I will tell you that I'm personally thrilled to be here in New Orleans. When you step on the streets of this city, it's hard not to think about the great heritage that Georgia has right here as a part of a string of Sugar Bowls back in the early 80s, Georgia's national championship back in 1980. This game won't have that kind of prize on the line on Tuesday night, but I agree with what you've said that in a lot of ways the springboard for what Georgia could do in 2019 could begin against the Longhorns on Tuesday. Thank you so much for being a part of this very special live edition of DN90 from New Orleans. We'll have exciting video coverage throughout the next couple of days for you here from New Orleans, including Georgia coach Kirby Smart tomorrow morning, a special edition of Dog Nation Daily, maybe a slightly different time for us given Smart's media availability, but we'll have Dog Nation Daily live for you tomorrow as well, and a lot of fun and surprises on the way too, not just here on the Dog Nation video channels, but at DogNation.com where Mike Griffith will be writing. Of course, don't forget to check out Jeff Sintel's recruiting coverage from Orlando this week, on his way to San Antonio after that for the big announcements from Jaden Hazelwood and Tyreek Stevenson next week. It's a busy time here around Dog Nation. We appreciate you being a part of it, and a huge thanks to Dixie Vodka for making this live DN90 possible. Make sure you check out Dixie Vodka online at DixieVodka.com or at your favorite liquor store. You'll truly come to know what we already believe around here, that Dixie Vodka is the South's best tasting vodka. We'll see you tomorrow morning once again from New Orleans. Let's get ready for a fun Sugar Bowl, and Happy New Year to all of you all around Dog Nation.